Welcome to the Reality Revolution. This is a huge day for the podcast. We get Mitch Horowitz, one of the best writers of all time about self-help and metaphysical writing. And so I was so desperately wanted to talk to him and meet him. And it's like meeting my hero. I'm super nervous right now because I get a chance to talk to one of my heroes that has written so many books that I've read. The really cool thing about Mitch is when I read his writing, I hear his voice because he's such an incredible narrator and narrating so many incredible audiobooks. He's explored all the things that I've been super fascinated by, and I've learned so much from him. So welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on, Mitch.
Thank you, man. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. I'm very touched and very glad to be here. Thank you.
So the really incredible thing that you have added to this is that you come from a journalistic background. When you read The Miracle Club, one of my favorite books of yours, you talk a little bit about your past. You were working on politics and even crime writing. Yep. And so you bring this journalistic idea to your writing. So a lot of self-help literature and metaphysical literature doesn't have that desire to go back and look at the facts and the history. You're also a historian. So you've added a lot to the discussion of new thought authors and a lot of this stuff. So I really appreciate that. I just wanted to get your discussions of how you've gone about researching the stuff that you have.
Sure. Self-help methods, motivational methods, esoteric philosophies, self-development philosophies were always part of my life. And I suppose starting in the early 2000s, they became more and more a part of my life, occupying my work as a writer, as a publisher. But coming from a more diffuse background, I suppose was helpful to me, not only in honing my writing skills, but I hope in being well-rounded. I hope in being able to bring matters of social relevancy into the field of self-help and the esoteric and alternative spirituality. My wish is not only to be relevant to my readers and listeners, but to also be starkly honest with them. Mm-hmm. I feel that there are so many people who make a living selling different alternative spiritual philosophies, different therapeutic and motivational philosophies, mm-hmm. and they develop a kind of stump speech approach where you ask a question and you'll always get one of 9 answers, and you'll never hear from them about their own internal process, including their failures. And anybody who's not willing to talk to you earnestly and specifically about their failures is not being frank, is not being real. Mm-hmm. I've had the experience myself of working with or interviewing various New Age figures, including some very big names, some very recognizable names. And I've seen how the sausages are made, and I've seen how sometimes some very well-known people will fall apart under the slightest pressure. And yet they never make that admission in their work. And I do believe in their ideas, or I wouldn't be working with them, collaborating with them.
Right.
But at the same time, I don't believe in masking our failures or in presenting a front to the reader or to the listener that's inauthentic in terms of the experiences of my daily life. And I think that we need a revolution in frankness, in bluntness, yes. in realness within the self-help philosophies. And I don't dig when different writers kind of either mythologize their past or conceal their present so that the listener is left to feel like, wow, that person so has it together. How can I ever live up to that? How can I ever aspire to that?
Right.
The truth is, their lives are filled with holes, sometimes that are greater than those of their listeners, which doesn't mean that there isn't so much richness and wealth of ideas and gravity of ideas within the alternative spiritual culture. But I think we need a great dose of disclosure, of transparency, of realness. So right. I think coming from a different background, maybe helped me to enter
Yeah.
the field with a dedication to those values as well.
Well, I think that especially Chief Definite Aim and Miracle Club kind of outlined the struggles I was going through and your journey through those struggles to your success, where you're talking about, because, you know, of course, I'm following all of these techniques and it's not working. You know, maybe it's a little bit, but you're
Yeah.
saying, hey, you need to pick one thing and make that your chief definite aim. What is that, as you say in the Miracle Club, what's that thing your soul wants and pleads for? What's connecting to your heart? And so
Yeah.
I owe you for a lot of the success I've had is by saying, okay, a lot of that stuff's not important. I need to really focus on that one chief definite aim. And because of that, you really make a really great argument in those books for, yeah, you might be able to go manifest a cup of coffee, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about
Right.
connecting to your heart and finding your soul's purpose and your chief aim. That's when the magic happens.
I really believe that's true.
Yeah.
And I've lived by that in my own life. I came to realize some years ago that my chief aim was that I wanted to document metaphysical practice in history and in experience. And I wanted to do that at ever higher and higher levels, ever greater levels of public exposure. And it opened up everything for me because it helped me to realize what it was that my psyche was unified around, whether I was ignoring it or not.
Right.
And it's difficult and it's challenging for people to choose a really passionately felt, absolutely singular chief aim, because naturally we all feel that life makes multiple demands on us. We're parents, we're workers, we're caregivers, we're artists, we're soldiers, we're students. We have all kinds of things that we're asked to do, that we're called upon to do. I have 2 sons. I have all kinds of financial obligations to various people in my life. And, you know, one could say, how is it possible to really select one aim? And I would offer that life presents us with a really tough bargain, which is that you're very likely to get something close to what you want if you can be absolutely singular about it. And a well-selected aim can cover a lot of different bases, It may not cover everything, you know, truth be told. It may not cover everything. There may be people in our lives who want more of our attention, who do not receive it because there is a singular focus and aim from which we're operating. But those same people may receive other things, needful things, necessary things, positive things. But that one aim does have to stand paramount. And it's a tough bargain. It's a tough bargain.
Yeah.
We
There's
all
a bargain.
like life is a multi-spoked wheel, and it is.
Yeah.
And also, obviously, there are things we cannot neglect, like health. If we neglect our health, a philosopher once said to me, if you don't give something its proper attention now, it will take all of your attention later. So if you don't give a relationship proper attention, or if you don't give your health proper attention, those things might become crises that demand all your attention later. So one has to live with that too. And there's no absolute perfect recipe that's going to erase every paradox or erase every seeming contradiction. We have to kind of keep on looking out for those. That said, one single definite aim for which we feel obsessive passion, which we experience as needfully as we do breath itself, is the best guarantee of getting that where we want to go.
And I'm living proof. It's absolutely true, and it's a wonderful teaching. One of the things that I really relate to you, and the woman in the Miracle Club that comments to you after, I think, a speech, she says, how do you sleep? You have this striving for information all the time. I'm very much like that too. You're constantly, I can see it in your writing, this hunger for knowledge. Even if you think you know everything, there's got to be more out there. The way that you relate to new thought authors, everything. And that's one of the things I love about your writing. It just seeps through is this love, this hunger for more information. There's got to be something else out there.
I appreciate that. That was funny. The story that you're referencing, I was speaking at this very high tone retirement home in upstate New York, and they had a speaking program.
Right.
And the woman came up to me at the end, and she was speaking like an East European accent. And she said to me, "How do you sleep at night?" And I said, "What?" I thought, I was being accused of being some kind of a monster.
Right.
How do you sleep at night?
Right. The first thought, I could see that.
Right. Your mind is always going. And then I realized what you're referencing. And it is true. My mind is always going. And that would be true whether I had a chief aim or not.
Right.
I'm just constructed that way, as some of us are. And I do sleep at night, but I sleep at night because I drive myself to exhaustion. I use my mind and I use my body as much as I can to the max during the day, driven by my aim. And so when I sleep, I really sleep, although probably my mind is always buzzing and always processing.
Right.
I mean, that's true. We all know that our intellect is never dormant. We may be in a dream state, but it's very relevant what's going on. But it's a pleasure for me, to have my mind running all the time, because it's focused on my chief aim, because it's focused on questions of metaphysics, historically, practically, and these are my absolute passions. So in that sense, all this excess energy has a positive place to go.
Well, you and I share a deep love for Neville Goddard. I'm still a student, and one of the things that you've done is you've read a lot of his books. I recommend all of the books that Mitch reads of Neville's. They're fantastic. The Law and the Promise, Infinite Possibility is a great compilation of his lectures. Before I get into it, I just want to, as somebody that's read his lectures, there's a state that you reach when you read his lectures of understanding. I recommend, if you want to understand Neville, read his lectures out loud. There is something that, there's another level of understanding. Do you agree with that?
Neville is one of the most extraordinary figures to have emerged from the modern mystical scene, the modern metaphysical scene. And I think Neville is going to emerge, and is emerging right now in our own generation, as the most widely read, widely quoted, influential figure to come out of the New Thought or mind metaphysics movement. And it's funny because when I first started writing about Neville back in 2005, very few people had heard of him. I had only recently learned of him. I had learned of him maybe 18 months earlier, and I fell into him completely, as people often do. Because when you read Neville, as you're alluding, you feel absolutely transported. Absolutely transported.
Exactly.
When you're listening to him, whether you're reading his books, reading his lectures out loud, there's such symmetry and beauty and simplicity, and yet radical qualities to his ideas that you feel enlisted into this whole other possibility and perspective on life. And for your listeners who may not know Neville, although probably most do, his one teaching is your imagination is God, and that everything you experience, including these words right now, including our exchange right now, is rooted in you. We are simply figments of you, the listener. Your intellectual development, your life within has produced us, effectively. Right. And Neville meant this in the most literal sense. And I think that as time passes, his teachings and his ideas are also coming to be seen, in my view, as the most effective mystical analog to quantum theory, to quantum physics. I think there's a whole new generation of folks, including students of physics, including students of quantum mechanics, who are going to start to see Neville as an adjunct to their work in the same way that many people within science and within spirituality in general view Alan Watts, for example, the Zen scholar, not just as some guy who was into Zen, but as a true philosopher for our times and a perennial philosopher. Neville is coming to be seen that way. It's incredible when you enter his work. It's an experience like almost no other writer. I've had this experience maybe reading only Ralph Waldo Emerson and
Mhm.
Very, very few other writers. You feel completely transported. You feel like someone is holding out to you a radically different perspective on life that's just right there for the asking, right there for the asking.
Mhm. Not
And
complicated, not complicated. No.
uncomplicated,
Mhm.
radical, simple, persuasive, symmetrical. He was beyond the ordinary. He really
He
was.
really was. So yeah, that's the thing that I came to it from a quantum physics and then perspective a little bit at the beginning. And I could see that he's really talking about exploring parallel realities
For sure.
as more we understand about the possibilities around it. Even in Out of This World, he kind of makes comments about it a little bit. But that's what I agree. It's completely consistent with the what we're understanding now about quantum physics. So
It
absolutely.
really is. Out of This World may be his greatest work in terms of
Hmm.
correlating to quantum theory. And he was writing all this stuff way before the popularizations of these ideas. I think he instinctively and in an illuminated way understood some of the things that we're now coming to theorize about within the quantum
Right.
field. And he did it, going back to the late 1940s at a time when
Right.
this material was not available in a popular way.
Right. So I want to ask, since you are a historian, and I talked a little bit about Kate Jeggedy. Um, of course, you become fascinated as soon as you read Neville. You want to know everything about him, and there is not a lot about him. You've gone about trying to research the history about where he grew up and some of the background. So I'd love to know a little bit more about that, or what you found about behind the scenes of the. I mean, when you read Israel Regardie's
Mhm.
forward, you get a little idea that he was an actor, and you kind of get a little bit idea of his personality behind the scenes. But there's really not a lot. So that's one thing I wanted to talk to you about. Were you able to find anything more behind the scenes historically about Neville in your work?
Yeah, I write historically about Neville in my books, One Simple Idea, in The
Hmm.
Miracle Club. I found that some of the boldest claims Neville made about himself do stand up to
Hmm.
forensics. For example, one of the things I've written about is that Neville was drafted into the army during the Second World War, and he was a little bit older. He was in his late 30s, but men
Right.
could be drafted up until pretty advanced ages during the war,
Hmm.
and it wasn't altogether unusual. And he said he really wanted to get out of the army, didn't want to be there,
Right.
and that he laid down on his army cot, basic training, and imagined himself back home in New York City, and did this for several weeks, and then out of the clear blue received an honorable discharge that had been denied to him at some point earlier. And
Hmm.
this sounded very unrealistic to me, that the US Army at the height of the war effort would just honorably
Right.
discharge an able-bodied male in basic training. And I was able to locate Neville's surviving military records.
Oh
Some
wow.
have been lost in a fire at a records facility 1 year after Neville's death, of all things. But the remaining records indicated that he was honorably discharged, and he had been discharged um, according to the record sheet to resume work in a vital civilian occupation. And I spoke to a army spokesman and said, this man was a metaphysical lecturer. What was the vital civilian
Hmm.
occupation that he was returning to? And he could offer me no other details, but all the forensics matched up exactly as Neville
Wow.
described it. He was in the military for about 4 months. He was discharged honorably while still in basic training. And I can't say what happened, but I had case after case after case of researching Neville's life where I found that his claims did stand up in
Hmm.
terms of the the names, the dates, the logistics, the forensics of what went on. And he lived for much of his life here in New York City, which is home to me. He died in Los Angeles, where he also
Hmm.
spent a great deal of time. He was born to a large British family in the island of Barbados.
Hmm.
Um, he had a couple of marriages. One was a very, very early marriage that seemed to be a mistake, but another was a longer lasting marriage later in life. And one of the most remarkable things about Neville, and one of the reasons why relatively little, in fact, very little biographical information is available, is that he never really pursued fame or public notice, which
Right.
is strange in itself because he started out his career as a dancer and an actor. He was a very handsome man. He looked like a matinee idol. He looked and sounded like Cary Grant, spoke with this beautiful mid-Atlantic accent,
Hmm.
really truly had the looks and the appearance of a matinee idol, and yet submitted to very few photographs. Today, every 15 seconds, people are posting photos of themselves on Instagram and social media, just hungering for likes and public adulation. And well, obviously, those things didn't exist in Neville's day. He sat for maybe 3 professional photographs that I personally know of. When I first started researching him, there was just one photo of Neville online that would get used over and over again. And I
Right.
found a couple of others which I posted, but very, very few. And someone who looked and sounded and presented himself as Neville did, really, he had the charisma and the appearance of a movie star. You would think would have been out there more, in the world, but
Right.
his life was one of real self-sufficiency. He didn't have a business apparatus at his back. He worked like a kind of artisan. He worked like a kind of troubadour, traveling from place to place,
Right.
giving his talks, selling some books and pamphlets, some of which were self-published, some of which were published by very small metaphysical presses. He dealt with his correspondence. I wouldn't say he was a private man. I wouldn't say he was a public man. He was just a very self-sufficient man. And the stories that he told have, by my reckoning, been true.
Hmm.
But one thing I was unable to find, and one elusive aspect of Neville's persona, is that he described being tutored by a man of
Abdullah.
Black Jewish descent named Abdullah, a
Right.
turban figure here in New York City. And there are no records in the press or in any other evident public places of Abdullah.
Hmm.
Some people have questioned, was this a real guy? Was this
Right.
mythology? Was this a composite? And I don't have the answers to that.
Right.
I've visited buildings where Abdullah was said to live. I've been in the lobby. It may be literal truth. It may be a composite. I really don't know. I really don't know.
If he wasn't real, that's even cooler. I think it would just be the coolest thing if it turns out Abdullah wasn't real. I don't know. There's part of me that says, I think that's fantastic if he wasn't. I don't know. It doesn't
Yeah.
bother me that much. So,
Well, I think that, I identify a figure who might have been Abdullah, but the timeline doesn't fully match up. So
right.
I'm not at all sure I'm correct about that. Very often, I have found that when a figure is real in occult history, however obscure they may be, they show up somewhere.
They show up somewhere.
They
So
show
is
up.
Joseph Murphy, somebody said that there's in writings in Joseph Murphy's,
Yeah.
was there a reference to Abdullah there? Is that
Yes.
okay?
I read about that in One Simple Idea. Towards the end of Murphy's life, he died in 1981. He
Hmm.
gave a series of interviews to a French writer from Quebec, and these interviews were published only in French by a Quebecois press. And
Right.
in this book, which I quote in The Miracle Club and a couple of other places, Murphy, too, who was contemporaneous with Neville, and they did know one another
Hmm.
here in New York, makes reference to being tutored himself by Abdullah, which is the only other corroborating reference
Okay.
of Abdullah that exists. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
And these interviews have only been published in French.
In
I do
French.
publish a translation in One Simple Idea. And it's so intriguing and it's so fascinating
Yeah.
because here, years after Neville's death, is the only corroborating instance of Joseph Murphy saying, yes, I studied under Abdullah as well.
Right.
And it's quite remarkable. It's quite interesting. You mentioned Israel Regardie's portrait of Neville,
Right.
which he wrote in 1946 for a book called The Romance of Metaphysics. And Regardie was fascinated with Neville and loved Neville.
Yeah.
And Regardie is the first one who made reference to Abdullah as a rabbi. Neville spoke of Abdullah
Mhm.
as a black man of Jewish descent, a man of Ethiopian descent, and it was Veraldi who first referred to Neville as an eccentric Ethiopian rabbi, in his words. So this idea that Neville was that Abdullah was a rabbi began to develop. Neville, to my knowledge, never made that reference himself, and so this is how myth and legend develops.
Right.
Doesn't mean it's not true. Doesn't mean it's not true. But there's this kind of free-for-all quality where Israel Veraldi had something, Joseph Murphy had something, and it's difficult to unravel. Some things just have to remain a mystery.
Well, the interesting clue that was worth, I was wondering if you had gone down the rabbit hole, was when Israel's talking about Neville exploring Rosicrucians. He was a Rosicrucian in his, what Neville calls his state of John, when he was not drinking and during that period, he's heavily, and I don't know heavily, but he's into the Rosicrucian, which Israel Veraldi has knowledge of, writing about the Golden Dawn. I'm wondering do you think that Neville might have been with like the Golden Dawn or some secret societies, or that we didn't know about? I mean, we know he's with Rosicrucians, at least, and I've read about and explored that a little bit. So I kind of have a tenuous idea of what he was exploring, mostly meditative techniques and nothing really radical or, but.
Yeah, well, he was bopping around a lot of different occult groups for a while and experimenting with a lot of different ideas and philosophies. I know he was influenced by the French mind theorist Émile Coué, because, and I'm a big admirer of Coué's, because Neville uses phraseology in some of his books, including Freedom for All, that echoes Coué. So he definitely was influenced by Coué, but he was so original in his way of thought. He was so unprecedented. I haven't found any other teachings that really bear the thumbprint of Neville's idea. Right. He wrote that he writes a little bit about his own spiritual progress and development and some things he experiences in transcendent states and in waking dream states or meditative states. But primarily, he talks about his realization that scripture is an illumined book written in symbolism, and that if you can read scripture through fresh eyes, if you can cleanse the doors of perception, so to speak, and read scripture as it's really intended, that's where his philosophy, his ideas, his teachings about the godlike nature of your imagination are all from. So he really relied directly upon Old and New Testament.
Can you think of another writer that did that? Is there another writer that explored the Bible in that way?
The only other writer I can think of is William Blake. Blake.
Which he refers to a lot.
Blake was certainly that way. Blake was an illumined intellect who explored scripture that way. Emerson was that way, although Emerson drew more broadly upon different spiritual philosophies, quotes more broadly from different spiritual philosophies. But I would say Blake is the only other such figure.
Right. So it's impossible to interview Mitch Horowitz in an hour, but I'm going to try to see. We got 30 minutes. We talked about some Neville Goddard. And thank you for that. There's so many other things. One thing I recommend everybody subscribe to Mitch's Medium account. He's writing some fantastic articles that are coming out on a regular basis. You have a new book, Secrets of Self-Mastery, that just came out that I can't wait to read. So taking the ideas that we talked about here and going on with it a little bit, you write about the occult, you write about so many other things, and I'm sure that you're still exploring new stuff right now. And one of the really fascinating things about your writing is talking about Occult America, about behind the scenes. We've been exploring the occult, even going all the way back to Ronald Reagan. I wanted to just ask first before we go into, I've gone down the rabbit hole of Aleister Crowley at one point. His hagiography is completely fascinating. It may be not true, but it's so. And you've kind of briefly mentioned, of course, I know you've read some of his stuff. So, what is your impression of Aleister Crowley?
Well, I have very conflicted feelings about him, as many people do. I think he was a brilliant artist, a brilliant seeker, a brilliant occultist,
Mm-hmm.
great intellect. A lot of people around him also got hurt. There was a
Right.
callousness, there was a cruelty. I think in some ways a lack of honor in terms of,
There's a dark side to it.
yeah, the reciprocity that he showed or failed to show to other people.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I do think that some of the things that he produced, like the Book of the Law, just have the markings of material that comes from an absolute transcendent source, a truly,
Right.
truly transcendent source. I think he was a truly, truly great artist and occultist. I am not particularly warm to really detailed rituals, really
Right.
detailed, complex techniques and operations. I tend more to go for things that are very, very simple,
Simple.
very, very basic, cut right to the source,
Right.
which is why I'm dedicated to Neville. I have a piece on Medium called Anarchic Magic, and it's my manifesto of what I practice. It's a very recent piece. It's at the top of my feed on Medium.
Mm-hmm.
And this piece on anarchic magic is about the importance of spontaneity, about the importance of, for me at least, simplicity, of going to things that cut right to the source. I'm interested above all else in practicality, in result,
Right.
in the querent, the user, the participant, feeling a difference in
Right.
his or her life, in his or her experience, in his or her conduct, getting somewhere.
Right.
So that to me is the single most important measure of any magical or ethical or spiritual philosophy. I am not down with very detailed rituals, so I deeply respect Crowley and Rigardi and the Golden Dawn and other ceremonial magical traditions, but I tend to be much more advocating of very self-directed ideas, very simple ideas, very powerful unifying ideas. If you feel that you're doing something, whether it's a magical exercise, a mental exercise, a ceremonial exercise, an act of prayer, that is self-unifying, that unifies your psyche. And by psyche, I mean your emotions, your physicality, your intellect.
Right.
And you feel a kind of wholeness of effort and a complete, total dedication and unification of self wrapped up in whatever it is you're doing and pursuing, whether it's saying a prayer, doing a ceremony, embarking on a visualization, affirmation, whatever it is.
Right.
I maintain that's effectiveness. That's effectiveness.
Right.
Anytime that unification of psyche, of physicality, of intellect, of emotion has been present in me, when I have been exploring a way of concretizing my will, outpicturing my will, that's been
Right.
the circumstance of success. And that's kind of what anarchic magic is about, because there's not a great deal of planning that goes on in it. There's a great deal of self-education, but when the moment comes, you act on it the way an artist might act on it.
Right.
And
Is it the same as chaos magic or similar?
I see it as different from chaos magic insofar as I suppose I do more to emphasize spontaneity, being of the moment. Sigil magic has not worked for me. I have experimented with sigil magic. I respect sigil magic. I will continue to experiment with sigil magic, but it has not worked for me. And perhaps I'm neglectful of pointing out in my article that there are, of course, many different kinds of sigil magic, and I focus in my article on the most traditionally practiced one, and there are many different kinds. So in that sense, I would have to say that anarchic magic and chaos magic are cousins. They are cousins.
They're related. Yeah.
But I do place a definite emphasis on deity, on theism, on spontaneity, on just completely acting with a total sense of abandon in terms of whatever you want to pursue, and hence being ready to act with that sense of abandon almost anywhere, anytime.
I love it.
Yeah,
so there's that part of our, I think, collective psyche that when magic comes up, there's that fear, that part of that we were taught from kids. Hey, there's demons, and so it's interesting. it's just a natural, I think, response when people collectively start talking about magic. That's why there's a separation in the literature. There's people that talk about self-help and metaphysics, and then magic is separate. And when you read some of the magic stuff, there's great writing that people are missing out on because it's been separated. And that's what's great. You're willing fearlessly to explore any of this stuff.
Oh, without question. You
Yeah.
know, you mentioned demons, for example. You know, demon is just a late ancient term that took on negative connotations as the early church was solidifying its authority within the Western and parts of the Eastern world and vanquishing the ancient religions. So the idea of a daemon or a spirit or a genii or, you know, something,
Right.
you know, some invisible force, help, personified energy that could assist the individual was identified as being malevolent, whereas the practitioners of such methods didn't have that association at all. I mean, in the Hellenic world, for example, the Greek and Roman traditions would speak of genii, of these beings that could help the individual, and later these things were daemon, and later these things were classified as what we call demons, and in English, in the kind of, you know, Anglican phonetics, and were classified as being malevolent. I don't know that they're malevolent at all. And I wish for the individual his or her highest sense of experiment.
Right.
Let's learn. Let's find
Let's
out.
learn.
However,
Your article on Satan is absolutely fantastic. Somewhat, you know, I guess controversial, but I loved it. And I recommend anybody read it. And another example of your fearlessness. A lot of writers would be like, you know, I'd love to write about this, but maybe I'll just avoid that topic because it's going to be so controversial, right?
Yeah. And I've often thought about that because, you know, my writings on Satanism, and your listeners should understand that I have my own very independent, but I also think historically valid interpretation of what that is. And it does not coalesce with the traditional or mainstream
right.
reading of that term and that idea. And if anybody's interested, there are pieces galore about that on Medium, and they can explore my perspective and see if it resonates with them.
Mm-hmm.
I think it has historical validity.
Mm-hmm.
I have to go where my search leads me. I have to go where the search leads me. You know, I realize that terminology is really off the rails in terms of our culture. Right. And I'm not insensitive to that. I'm not oblivious to that. And I'm not trying to court controversy. I have zero interest in cheap controversy and provocation for its own sake. Absolute zero interest in that. And it's painful to be misunderstood. You know, I do not like being misunderstood. Nobody likes being misunderstood. Right. I've been kicked out of organizations because of my research into Satanism, because of my writings about Satanism, because of my lectures about Satanism.
Right.
It's painful, you know.
I can imagine, yeah.
I've lost friendships. I've lost income. I've lost opportunities. And so being misunderstood is painful. It's not fun. Right. I don't look to court controversy, but at the same time, I have to go where my search goes. My writing is nothing but my exploration as a seeker of what I'm about, what I'm exploring. I don't see myself at all as a teacher, as a guru, as some sort of a therapist, as a ministerial figure. I am a seeker. I am a seeker. And I'm just sharing where I am on the road with other people. And if it resonates with them, that's great. That's all to the good. And so when I go somewhere, there's no difference. There's no demarcation between my search and my writing and my speaking and my narration and my screen work. Everything I do is one thing, So if I don't go there, I'm dead. If I don't go there, I have abandoned the nature of my own search and my own work. I'm being a fake. So
the fearlessness is what I appreciate. You're willing to write about anything clearly, and I love that. You're not just custom tailoring an article so a lot of people will read it, and that's what's so I love so much. It comes out in so thank you for that. So the thing that we share is this love for New Thought authors also, and we got a few minutes, we can go over some of the other New Thought authors. This New Thought movement that came about going back to Wallace Wattles and William Walker Atkinson, is there any authors that you have found that, other than the ones in Neville, and that maybe new, that were in that movement that you may have recently discovered that we have not maybe heard about?
Well, that's a great question. I'm always looking for voices that I really find penetrating within the New Thought world, within that tradition. The voices I've found who are most powerful are, in addition to Neville, you mentioned Wallace D. Wattles. I think his book, The Science of Getting Rich, has so many folds and layers within it. It's really a masterpiece. And I think that's truly one of the greatest works that's ever come out of the New Thought tradition. Napoleon Hill, very familiar name. And yet I think within Napoleon Hill's work, Law of Success, Think and Grow Rich, Master Key to Riches, there are just tremendous, tremendous insights. And I have a very, very deep and long abiding respect for Napoleon Hill's work.
Let's talk about, keep going. I'll let you get.
No, there's other names I could mention, none of whom would be particularly surprising. Ernest Holmes, Joseph Murphy. I like Earl Nightingale, the radio broadcaster who produced the lecture, The Strangest Secret. I like Earl because I think that he just brought such a reassuring American persona to metaphysical ideas that would be difficult for some people to swallow if it wasn't coming from someone like Earl, who presented such a wonderful solidity in his persona, in his voice, in his public presence. And I really admire that, because I do think presentation is very important. I admire Florence Scovel Shinn. I admire Elizabeth Town. I do think I admire Roy Herbert Jarrett, who went by the initials RHJ. He wrote that little pamphlet, It Works.
It Works, yeah.
I do think that with the death of Joseph Murphy in 1981, New Thought did fail from within its own ranks to produce compelling figures. And I think the scene is pretty poor today. There are some figures who I really like and admire today. Kate Shigete is one of them. Harv Bishop is one of them. A couple of others. But by and large, I think the New Thought movement has produced a lot of childish material today, a lot of pablum, because people are just so safe. They're so concerned with being safe, and they're not revealing enough of self, and they don't take enough chances, and they don't grow. And we've settled into a kind of immature language, a pep rally atmosphere.
So true. It's absolutely true.
This movement as an intellectual movement will not survive if we don't produce voices that are mature, that are compelling. And I think that's been a huge deficit in New Thought over the past 2 generations.
There's no doubt. There's definitely a deficit from then, this explosion of incredible literature. William Walker Atkinson is interesting with all the pseudonyms and Yogi Ramacharaka, and I've been exploring. There's way more than I had thought, and he was a terrific writer, and he was bringing a lot of Eastern mysticism also. But Napoleon Hill, you mentioned that, and I have this huge love for Napoleon Hill. The Law of Success, as you say, is my favorite book of his. People talk about Think and Grow Rich, but The Law of Success is a masterpiece. I got the impression that was his baby that he had worked on all the time. It wasn't Think and Grow Rich. That came afterwards. You can tell that his baby was Law of Success. That he had worked on this for decades.
Yeah.
The interesting thing, the historical thing about Napoleon Hill that I find interesting, he wasn't this super successful guy. He was a struggler, like he talks about. He was a struggler, and that's why I respond to him, because I was a struggler. I get where he's coming from. He's overcoming the struggle.
Yes.
And that is why it's so powerful.
Yes, and I think you put your finger on it with regard to Law of Success. That is his masterwork. Virtually all of Hill's thought is in Law of Success, and he spent the remainder of his career repackaging it, reformatting it.
Right.
Think and Grow Rich is one of the greatest book titles of all time.
Right.
Certainly within the self-help field, maybe the greatest book title within the self-help field, and that it is so memorable, it is so compelling. And yet, there's nothing in Think and Grow Rich, or relatively little that you won't also find in Law of Success. I think that within Think and Grow Rich, he definitely developed the idea of sex transmutation, which I appreciate and which I'm a huge admirer
Right.
of Phil's way of thought in that area. He definitely he developed the idea of cosmic habit force a few years later in his book, The Master Key to Riches.
Mm-hmm.
So those were notable post Law of Success insights.
Right.
And I applaud that. And that those ideas have been very meaningful for me. But by and large, he did spend the rest of his life explicating what he laid down in
Right.
Law of Success in 1928. It is a masterwork, and I find new things in it all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. Most people will talk about Napoleon Hill, not Think and Grow Rich, but Law of Success is just special. It's a special book. But when I was reading the history, he, I think, got in trouble financially at some point, and Napoleon, he had some things happen, along the way, which when you read him, you can feel that genuine desire to overcome.
Yes.
He's not to overcome these things. That's why it resonates.
Yes, I dig that, and you're absolutely right. I mean, he went through business failures,
Mm-hmm.
failures with business partners, difficult divorces, and he was in a very, very tight spot, probably in the early 1960s. And there was a figure, an insurance executive named Clement Stone, who came to his rescue.
Right.
He founded the Napoleon Hill Foundation, and he sort of lifted Hill up and created a modern business apparatus around him. But Hill had ups and downs in his life. He
Right.
went through boom and bust cycles, and I think it's important for us all to be frank about that. And there are also things in his personal life that I really disdain, and I write about that in my book, One Simple Idea.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to come back again and again to the point that Think and Grow Rich has impacted my life for the better in ways that I cannot overemphasize. I cannot overstate. Law of Success and Think and Grow Rich have been radical, pivotal, positive turning points in my life. I recommend them to everybody, absolutely everybody.
Well, anybody that reads Think and Grow Rich, immediately afterward, go read Chief Definite Aim, because you capture the key to Think and Grow Rich is the Chief Definite Aim. You really capture it should be read both together, and that's what I recommend anybody. We got a little, the time is running, so I want to go over some crazier stuff, because so you do a foreword to Paul Selig's book, which is a wonderful channeled work I love so much, and I wanted to get your impression on it's tangentially related, but it's a part of what we're exploring when we talk about the universe, and some channeled works. And first of all, what is your impression of channeling, and how do you evaluate it and bring it into your overall knowledge of what's going on? I want to get your impressions of that. There's so many crazy and unusual channeled works. We've got Abraham and Bashar and the Law of One, which I want to talk but what is first of all, how do you evaluate those works and your impression of those?
That's a really good question, and I think about that a lot. The term channel was introduced in its spiritual sense in the 1930s by the medical psychic Edgar Cayce, and Cayce's work is referred to as channeled literature. Course in Miracles is channeled literature.
Mm-hmm.
Material by Jane Roberts is channeled. Paul Selig's books are channeled.
Mm-hmm.
Paul is probably the most significant, certainly most literate person functioning within the field of channeling today. It seems to me that channeling is a form of ESP that gets personified within the outlook of the individual channeler to be some sort of a source, a persona, a figure. Edgar Cayce referred to the source as the wellspring of his information. Helen Schuckman ultimately referred to Jesus as being the wellspring of her information. Jane Roberts, the figure of Seth. Paul makes reference to the guides. I think it's a form of ESP personified.
Right.
I could be wrong about that. There could be these other transcendent beings that are communicating with the individual. It's a tricky form of metaphysics, because I think that ESP or transcendent communication is also something that comes and goes. It's not like a light bulb that immediately flicks on and off every time you trip a switch, or a water faucet. And so I think the individual also has to approach these teachings with his or her own discretion heightened, because you could be experiencing things that are very true, very valid, very helpful. But there are maybe other times and other moments where you're experiencing things that are not so, and that can be very disorienting to the individual, and that can be very frustrating, because we want to experience consistency. In all matters of the occult, in all matters of metaphysics, there is truth, but there is not necessarily consistency. And because something occurred and really truly did occur, doesn't necessarily mean that it will occur again, or that it will occur in the same way. And it's human nature to want consistency, but consistency is not always present. So if one drinks from these waters, I would just say, do so with a great deal of personal discretion and agency. You can never sacrifice your own sense of outlook, judgment, evaluation to this kind of certainty and consistency.
That very well said. I mean, when somebody gets up to channel, what are they going to do if nobody's there? They're going to just keep going, right? They're going to, okay, well, I got people, I'm going to channel, right? So they're who knows, I'm not claiming anybody in particular, but there is some interesting information that comes from this channel work. Paul Selig's resonates with me when I feel his work. I can feel it viscerally. But going beyond that, we have these works like the Law of One that explore metaphysics on a doctoral level. Have you had a chance to read the Law of One?
No, I haven't. Matter of fact.
All right. Well, that's something. Maybe next time we talk, we can talk about that. Have you had access to any of Dolores Cannon's work?
No, I don't. Okay. A great deal of literature. The literature that I've mentioned is the literature that I've primarily been involved with, along with some other lesser known names. There is a book. There's a channeler who I believe is known as the Angel of Prague, one of whose books has been published in French. Actually, a couple of books perhaps published in French, but one translated into English. I've read that, and I find that material very, very valuable.
All right.
So that's a form of channeling that's not widely known commercially that I care very deeply about. The poet James Merrill used a Ouija board to construct some of his own epic poetry, and I suppose you could call that a form of channeling.
Yeah.
I found that profoundly moving and meaningful. So there are some lesser known names that I've been very interested in. When I say lesser known, I mean people who might have a literary reputation or a reputation among a certain circle of folk, but who don't necessarily loom largely within the alternative spiritual culture.
So some other ideas I've explored on my channel, just maybe you explore it with me. Have you had any access to reality transurfing? Have you read any by Vadim Zeland?
No.
Well, he is taking a law of attraction kind of to another level, and he explores this idea of the pendulum, which is if people are thinking at the same thought frequency, it creates an entity. It may not be conscious, but it could be like an egregore on some level. And we are constantly creating these pendulums that it's like a cyclone. They just pull your energy. So becoming aware of these pendulums, and I wanted to bounce that off of you and see if you'd seen that referred to in other literature, becoming aware of these pendulums and the way that you interact with them. Like I think comedians are like pendulum vampires. They figure out a way to pull the energy. You meet people that go to group functions. It's like they pull if we are creating our reality with our thoughts, there's another level that when group of people have similar thoughts, they're creating something else that is not game planned out when we talk about this stuff. I wanted to get your impressions. You kind of explore a little bit of that as well. And
for sure. I really resonate with that. I mean, I think that's one of the ideas, one of the reasons why ideas go viral, so to speak.
Right.
We think of an idea or a concept or a meme going viral as being something that belongs to the digital age. But of course, this existed earlier, like when post-World War II, the commercial pilot Kenneth Arnold experienced one of the first sightings of what came to be called flying saucers, and suddenly,
everybody.
He's in Washington State, and then suddenly in Los Angeles, in DC, in New York, everywhere, people are reporting these saucer sightings. And you could say, well, it's mass delusion. Oh, well, is it mass delusion? UFOs are being taken more seriously today than any other time in modern history. We have things on radar. We have things in cockpit footage, which one could theorize about, but effectively they're UFOs. Why did we start to notice these things
all at the same time?
Starting at a certain period in history. And of course, there could be all kinds of materialist explanations for that, but we really don't know. We really don't know. And one sees this phenomena where something will get interjected into the culture and suddenly seems to pick up steam, and it's abetted by digital culture, but it didn't begin with digital culture. And the concept of the egregore is a very interesting one. I speak about this idea of there existing these time collapses where events and phenomena from so-called past, present, future need to become mixed all into one. There are certain film directors who seem to have a gift for dropping an idea or a meme into their movies, and suddenly it seems to have resonance years later that nobody had ascribed to it at the time. Roman Polanski is a particular director who's very, very good at that. There's this wonderful kind of coincidence of cultural events that can occur at once among people who are not visibly or consciously connected, and yet they're all working around a certain idea. So I think that the collective thought and the virus-like nature of ideas is far more than just blind coincidence. There's something going on there, whether it's time collapse, whether it's quantum selectivity, whether it's some kind of mental causation, but we all think together in some way that is clearly causative. And there are so many other examples that I could reference, but I think that's a very real phenomenon.
One more question that, and if you don't know about it, that's great. Maybe I want to see if you found references to this idea. Another thing they explore is in a book called Tufti the Priestess and Reality Transurfing. I keep on finding connections to it in Carlos Castaneda, where he talks about the assemblage point. Is this idea that we create reality with an energy center that's behind our head called the plat. In yoga, it's a bindu, and that there's we can load up new realities through this energy point. Have you ever heard a reference to anything like that?
Sure. People talk about there being these different chakras or energy centers or the pineal gland or areas of the body that coincide with metaphysics. What I would say is that I think there's probably a complexity of things going on. Effects usually have a complexity of causes. And for example, people talk about the placebo response, which is so much deeper and so much more extraordinary than anything we've understood. And some materialist people will say, well, gee, it's nothing other than the release of endorphins in the body, these pain-reducing enzymes or biochemicals. And how do we know that? How do we know that? How do we know that's not one of 12 things that are going on, for example? How do we know that the release of endorphins, the reduction of swelling, the reduction of hypertension are one of dozens of things that go on in the body that represent physically what the prayer response looks like in the body? How do we know that's all that's going on? One of the blind spots of materialism and of our intellectual culture in general is that we define one association, and as soon as we've defined one association in a way that seems accurate, we burn the fleet. We smash Galileo's telescope. We say, we're done. We're done. There's nothing else to explore here because we've identified this one correlate. Well, there could be hundreds of correlates. There could be dozens of correlates. I think one of the reasons why, for example, people find it difficult to get at the root of problematic behaviors is that these behaviors themselves have a complex of causes. There's not just one thing going on. Positive behaviors also have a complex of causes. So I would say to people, don't get too hung up with looking for that one thing, that one secret ingredient, because the truth is there may be a complexity of ingredients.
Right.
And they also may be shifting at various times.
Well, Mitch, thank you so much. I could talk to you forever. So many of your books, and I really, really appreciate you spending the time with me and bouncing these ideas off of.
Pleasure.
And just to look up Mitch Horowitz on Amazon. If you haven't heard of him, where have you been? And go and find his books and read all of them. They're fantastic and wonderful, and they come from the heart, and they've helped your writing has changed my life.
Thank you.
I've been able to apply it, and I've been able to achieve goals that I never would have achieved without reading your writing, by taking some of this, cutting the wheat from the chaff, and saying, this is what really works. And so I can only just say thank you so much for what you've done, and keep on writing, and I appreciate it. And welcome to the Reality Revolution, Mitch.
Back at you. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I wish you every good thing. I wish your listeners every good thing, and I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Reality Revolution. Unlimited possibilities. Dedicated to the spirits who believe life is meant to be magical.
Check it out. He has some really good meditations, and you discuss.
It contains advanced viewpoints of the multidimensional human beings of the 21st century. I'm your host, Brian Scott. Sometimes you need to go back. We were able to visualize with exploring stuff that's fun to explore. I can tell. Unleash your potential.
Some topics on how to change the subconscious mind, and some.
I'm your host, Brian Scott.